Hi, so in my last video, I laid out 7 steps to skillfully deal with anger. And I wanted to come back and give you 2 real life situations of how 2 clients of mine applied these steps so you can get a sense of putting this into action. So I'm first going to talk about a couple who came to see me, Jean and Dave, who were stuck in a cycle of anger and resentment in their marriage. And of course, I changed the names with any client situation that I use, and I changed some of the details to protect anonymity. And then I'm going to share with you the story of Jamal, who is very upset about not getting promoted and an overall work situation. So when Jean and Dave came to see me, they had 3 boys, ages 10 to 16. Jean worked part-time, but also was the primary caregiver of the boys, and she also took care of the bulk of the household issues. And Dave worked full-time and provided the bulk of the income. And their marriage had been extremely difficult for years. They were both really stuck in resentment and anger. And I'm going to share with you like the first example that Jean shared with me when she walked in my door. And the example was that her husband would come home. He would kind of kick off his shoes randomly. He'd drop his coat. He'd be walking towards the family room to sit with the boys. He'd drop his other stuff, whatever he was carrying. So he would just sort of leave this trail on the floor, and then he would plunge into the couch with the 3 boys while she was getting dinner ready, getting dinner on the table. He would barely say hello, and she was angry. And I imagine there's a fair number of people listening who could relate to that, right? Now, from Dave's point of view, right, he worked a really long day. He commuted, he came home, he was exhausted. And he really didn't care if stuff was left on the floor. He didn't feel she had to pick it up. He didn't care if she picked it up. He just wanted to rest and not be bothered. And he felt like he was always being screamed at, yelled at, told he was doing something wrong. So the 2 of them were just sort of swimming in this sea of feeling unappreciated, feeling taken advantage of, resentment. Yeah, not good. So in walking through these steps with Jean, step number 1 for her, providing space in between the anger she would feel when he walked in and her action, adding in that space meant letting his stuff stay on the floor, not say a word, right? And breathe and assess. And obviously, since this was the type of event which is repetitive, she could take time when it wasn't happening to really process and think it through and sort of breathe into it. But pretty much it was required that she stop reacting and attacking immediately, because there was no moving forward with more of a cooperative relationship unless one of them was willing to change their behavior. So in working with people, I always would focus on what can you do about it? I know you want him to change, right? Or for Dave, he wanted Jean to change, but what can you do about it? So one thing Jean could do was not get upset, not verbalize her upset, take her time and think it through. So step number 2 is working with her on really what are the true feelings underneath that? What causes that anger? What's the deeper stuff? And the deeper stuff was really that she felt completely unappreciated. She felt neglected. She was not receiving from the relationship any kind of sustenance or what she might see as support. She wasn't feeling loved, right? That really, at the very core, was that she wasn't feeling loved. And yet, because the relationship had become sort of so tense and toxic, she didn't feel comfortable sharing those vulnerable feelings. So then step 3, which is thinking through, what do you really want to accomplish here, right? So is having your floor clean the most important thing? No, right? Even is having your husband hang up his jacket the most important thing? Probably no, because if he did that, let's say he put his shoes away neatly, hung his jacket, put his briefcase where it belonged, right? But paid you no attention, was resentful that he had to do it, that still would not solve the true problem. It wouldn't address those deeper emotions that Jean was having. So for her to think through, like, what do I really want to accomplish here? I want a marriage that feels mutually supportive. Okay. So is erupting in anger about the slobbiness, right? Is that getting you anywhere towards what you truly want? And the answer was no. So then the step of what do I need to accept here? And for Jean, what she needed to accept was that her husband was extremely stressed by work. He did work long hours, but the family did benefit from it. He was exhausted when he came home, and he never was going to be a neat person. She had married somebody who wasn't neat. She probably thought he would change. He didn't. She took it upon herself to keep the house clean, which I totally understand, right? We fill a vacuum. But if she could truly accept the fact that he was not really going to change that behavior in any easy way, then how does that impact her approach, right? And the other thing to accept in this situation ended up being that her husband didn't have enormous capacity to see beyond her anger. Some people are talented at this, but to be honest, most are not. And when you approach somebody with anger, it triggers their reptilian brain, and then you're basically two reptiles fighting, which, as I usually say, not a good thing for relationships, right? And he was not skilled at seeing her hurt underneath her anger at all. So accepting that, right, brought in the conclusion that if you want him to see that you're actually hurt, that you actually want more closeness and connection and support, and maybe that means something different to you than to him, but you're going to have to spell that out for him. So given the things needed to be accepted in this situation by Jean, could she accomplish her objective? Now, her objective, she'd already kind of figured out that her objective was actually to have a mutually supportive marriage and a closer connection, and that the main objective was not really who picked the stuff up. So the answer was yes, she probably could accomplish that. If she had stuck with the fact that she primarily wanted him to help around the house and help with the housework and be cleaner and neater, and she wanted to stay closer to him, that may not have been achievable. So I'm hoping like how I went through these steps on my last video is making a little bit more sense in terms of how you apply it to a situation. But I also do want to say, like, some of you might not feel like this is the biggest problem in the world. Although I have to say a bad marriage is really, really difficult to be in. And when it goes on for so long, it can really be hard to sort of step back and figure out how to change the pattern. But I also don't necessarily use like the worst examples in the world when I'm trying to illustrate a point for a YouTube video, because using those like extreme examples can really trigger people. Some might relate, some might not relate. This is more of a situation where I'd say many, many people can relate, even if it isn't the biggest problem in your life. Okay, I'm hoping that makes sense to you. And comment below. Let me know if that does or if that doesn't. So then in working with Jean, really working on how could she speak from a more vulnerable place, right? And I said in my last video, it's about assertive communication, which it is, right? But we can assert how we feel in sort of a calm and collected way, right? And when we do that from a place of vulnerability, if it is somebody who we are very close to, right? And somebody who doesn't put us down for our vulnerabilities, that can be a little trickier. But basically, if it's in a good enough relationship or a relationship where each party has the same objective, which they did here. Both people wanted a better marriage. They wanted to feel more connected. They wanted to feel more appreciated. And as I said in my assessment and Jean's assessment, it was not going to be Dave who'd be able to really kind of make the leap out of where he was without some very clear kind of guidance, right? So in working with Jean, for her to be able to speak with her husband, to let him know how much he means to her, to let him know that she does love him and care and really wants the marriage to work. And then also to express that she's feeling very, very neglected and unappreciated, and open up a dialogue about how they can shift things or improve things, right? Now, obviously, in working with a counselor, like particularly if it's both people, this is easier because the counselor can kind of guide and help people not get super triggered. And if a counselor sees a couple going into their like reptilian brain, can help bring everybody back down again. But staying in that emotionally regulated state, which was sort of step number one, right? Like to really not react in the moment, to calm down, to take space, to think things through. Then the dialogue can begin. And then the process of walking Dave through this was very similar. And at the end of the day, the deeper emotions for him were very similar to Jean's. And honestly, this is what I find with couples almost all the time, is that at the core, both people are feeling the same way. Now, very important, what makes one person feel appreciated is different than what makes somebody else feel appreciated, right? What makes one person feel loved is often different than what makes the other person feel loved. And on this topic, I should do an entire video on this, but this is actually a great book. And I keep it handy all the time. But the 5 love languages. People feel love and give love in different ways. So one other thing that was happening in this relationship was that Dave's love languages were both affirmations, like receiving praise, and physical touch, whereas Jean's love languages were acts of service. So Jean was clearly feeling like acts of service are not being done here, right? So she was definitely feeling like her love tank was totally empty, which meant she was stewing in resentment, which meant she had no interest in being affectionate to her husband. And then when she was very quick to criticize and yell and complain about his behavior or lack of helping her, that was really terrible for Dave, because with a love language of affirmation, when somebody criticizes you all the time, it's like you're getting the opposite of what makes you feel loved. It's like really, really bad. Like none of us like to be criticized, but for people who really value affirmation, like verbal affirmations, it's really, really hard. So they had this terrible dynamic going. But as I said, it really was Jean who had to kind of rise to the, top in terms of changing some of her behavior first, and then learning to speak vulnerably first. And then Dave was able to understand that for him to get what he wanted, right? So first, let me say the other thing Jean did, knowing that his love language was affirmations, or one of the love languages was affirmations, was to begin to affirm and let him know she appreciated him. So this is hard to do. I'm not saying that this isn't hard to do. And it's interesting, I did this as a video on anger, but it's turned more into like a couple situation. But these things all overlap, right? But she stopped being so quick to criticize. She began to give him more affirmations, and she began to speak more vulnerably about what she needed. And then Dave began to realize, for me to get the other love language I need, right, the physical affection, I might have to put in a little more effort here. But it then becomes not really transactional. I'm not saying it's transactional, but it's like, oh, okay, this is how I need to take care of her. And then she's more willing to take care of me. It can become more of a mutually supportive relationship. Like a mutually supportive relationship does not mean that both people do exactly the same things for each other, right? Because we're all different. So I hope that example was helpful. And I'm going to talk about a completely different example next. So Jamal came to see me right after he got passed over for a promotion that he really did think he was going to get. And he was so upset and angry, he could barely bring himself to go back to work. So his anger was really driven by that it's not fair, right? He felt like he had been doing exactly what he needed to do, way more than what he needed to do. He really thought he had a great relationship with his boss, his coworkers. So when the company decided to hire somebody from the outside to promote, instead of promoting him, he was livid, which I totally understand. And for Jamal, his automatic response to being angry was always to flee. So, right, we have this fight, flight, or freeze, and most of us have one habitual pattern. His pattern was to flee. So, in a way, that might have been a good thing because he was able to take some time to come in and talk to me about it rather than just simply like fighting and attacking the boss or the company or whoever he might have attacked with his anger. But he basically just wanted to run away, and yet he couldn't really, at least not until he found another job. But he wasn't sleeping. He was so angry, he wasn't sleeping. He wasn't functioning well at all. So step one wasn't overly challenging for him because he was able to put space in between the feeling and his action. And he did it in a fairly considerate way, which was to go and actually talk to somebody about the situation. But the space he was creating wasn't really kind of that relaxation that's going to take you out of your reptilian brain. He was still in his reptilian brain, in his flight mode, and a high degree of anxiety. So the first work was really to help him emotionally regulate some more. Like your anxiety is telling you that you're like in danger here and you're actually not, right? It's not a good situation. Understand the anger and it's not fair, but your income didn't drop. Nothing about your existing life has really changed all that much other than this hope was taken away from you, or this dream, or this belief, or this thing that actually you were looking forward to, right? So there's a disappointment in there, but we probably can calm the anxiety because nothing needs to happen and change, and we don't have to panic and rush into anything. We can sort of slow it all down and consider options. So I'm hoping that makes sense in terms of this putting space between the, event that upsets you and your reaction, your action from the feeling of anger that comes up. It's not really only taking space, right? It's emotionally regulating yourself. So then step number 2 was to explore with him, like, what are the emotions? What's the emotions underneath that anger? So certainly disappointment was there. A feeling of being betrayed. He actually was able to access a feeling of betrayal. Something he'd been counting on, led to believe was going to be his, and like the rug was pulled out without really any consideration for him, without really any explanation. And then the whole situation was really bringing up for him these negative core beliefs of I'm not good enough and I can't trust others. So often our negative core beliefs are underneath our habitual reactions, or are like, the fight, flight, freeze reactions we have. There's often a tie to the negative core beliefs from our childhood. And just as an aside, I do have a PDF on transform your negative core beliefs. It walks you through some steps to identify what those like really core beliefs are that might underlie your response to many, many things in your life. And then it walks you through 3 methods of beginning to transform those beliefs. So for Jamal, that's really what came up, were those negative core beliefs about not being good enough and not being able to trust others, right? And we needed to then sort of separate, okay, you learned those beliefs because XYZ happened when you were young, but now the situation is very different and you are able to access resources and change your situation. And you're also actually still a valued employee, just not as valued as you thought, which I get. Okay, so after identifying those true feelings, what did he want to accomplish? He basically wanted to keep his job until he could maybe find something that would bring him to that next level at a competitor. So once he was able to sort of calm down, think it through, he realized he liked his job, he liked his coworkers, he did want to move up and progress and earn more money, but he didn't have to do it immediately, and he could take his time, continue to work. Okay? So that was his actual objective. So what do you need to accept? For him, it was to basically accept the decision had been made, wasn't fair. He wasn't even sure why it was made. Maybe he'd be able to get more information over time. So then that could lead into another objective, right? And I think for him, the other thing to accept was that these negative core beliefs that were triggered needed a little work. If he wasn't going to really address those beliefs, these types of situations might continue to occur for him. Now, I'm not saying that he caused the lack of the promotion, but in terms of his response to it, in terms of how disabled he was by that event, the fact that he couldn't sleep, right? The fact that he couldn't function, that response was due to the negative core beliefs. So that was another thing he began to accept and became willing to work on. So given those things, he realized, okay, well, I can accomplish what I want, which is to keep this job. I probably could also accomplish having more of a conversation with my boss about what happened and why and how I felt in a way that maybe could actually benefit my career. So that's where the assertive communication came in. Because if Jamal had either run away and never brought it up, or had attacked and gotten super angry and self-righteous and it's not fair, and he probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of information. But by slowing the whole process down, really thinking it through, he was then able to use assertive communication, not aggressive, not passive. Go to his boss, say, I think you know how disappointed I was. I didn't get that promotion and I still don't really understand. And I would like to understand. I think it could benefit both me and my career as well as the company for me to really understand what happened there. And approaching a situation in that way where you are really, again, it's not dissimilar from the couple I talked about, because it's about how can we make this mutually beneficial? How can I assert what I would like to assert, which could be that I don't think it was fair, but I'm not like, right? All right. Anyway, I wanted to use a couple of fairly simple examples to illustrate that 7-step method of dealing skillfully with anger, reading what it's communicating to you, looking underneath it, processing what's the big picture that you want to accomplish here, and then how can you go about that. All right. I hope this was helpful. I'd be very curious to know what you think. I really appreciate you watching this video and your support of my channel. If you haven't subscribed, that'd be great if you would do that. And if you did like this video, please do give it a like. That's also a big help. And I look forward to seeing you next week.